Welcome to this episode of Extravagant Generosity, where we reflect on how the practice of generosity impacts our communities, touches our hearts, and works for a more just world. My name is Andrew Warner, Generosity Outreach Officer for the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. Today, I want to think with you about the role of pastors in fundraising. And to help reflect on this question, I'm turning to the Reverend Elizabeth Dilley, Team Leader for MESA, Ministerial Excellence, Support, and Authorization for the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. When it comes to fundraising, many wonder about the pastor knowing what people pledge and give to a congregation. A recent survey by the Lake Institute looked at the practices in American faith communities across the religious spectrum. It found that only half of the faith leaders, pastor, imam, rabbi, had access to what people gave to their congregations, and of those, only half looked. So about a quarter of faith leaders know what people gave and pledged. And yet, congregations with faith leaders who knew what people pledged and gave were more likely, much more likely, in fact, to see an increase in giving. The study underscored pastoral knowledge as a best practice of congregational generosity. Elizabeth, can you help explain why this matters?
I'd be glad to. I think there are a couple of reasons about this. And I want to share actually from my own experience. When I went into the ministry, I also believed that. I believed that I should not know who gave what. I believed that it might negatively impact the way I saw people, that I might treat different donors differently, that might in fact harm the integrity of my work. What I learned in time, actually in very quick order, was that this actually reflected my own personal discomfort with money, my own challenges in my relationship with money and the lack thereof. You know, I grew up in a pretty poor working class family, and while I went away to a terrific university and went to graduate school, I still carried a lot of that baggage with me. A few years after I started serving the church in Red Oak, Iowa, I also became a part-time health educator at a local nonprofit where I had the opportunity to interact with the executive director and CEO. And I saw and I learned so much from her about leadership generally, but also about financial leadership specifically. It was very important for this organization, for their executive director and their CEO, to know who gave what, so that she could properly thank donors, so that she could know what her donors were interested in, what their donors were interested in, so that when we were starting new initiatives, she would be able to find financial support, and not only that, but cheerleading support for the sort of work that we were doing. It really began to introduce a shift in my understanding as myself, as both a spiritual leader and as an organizational leader. I learned that our relationship to money, in part, reflects our relationship with God. It isn't the only thing that reflects our relationship with God, but it certainly does do that, just as our relationship with our neighbors, our families, our communities, all of those help reflect our relationship to God. So too does our relationship to money reflect that. And so as a spiritual leader, it's important to know what it is that people give to, why they give to the organizations that they support, and what they hope those organizations will do to create a just world for all.
Elizabeth, sometimes people worry that a pastor knowing giving information will affect their performance and really that they may prioritize some people over others. Can you speak to how we maintain integrity in our pastoral office with this knowledge?
Absolutely. As you know, our team is very concerned with the integrity of the pastoral office and ensuring that our pastors have a high degree of integrity and model appropriate boundaries with their congregations. And so boundaries are really important for all of our clergy. We do have ways, though, for clergy to hold appropriate boundaries and to strengthen their practice of ministry through things like clergy communities of practice, which help clergy learn to test out what is appropriate confidentiality in this or that situation. They have the opportunity to talk about that in small confidential groups focused on the growth of ministry. Clergy also are held accountable and are supported by our committees on ministry, who do provide ongoing support for ministers as they seek to follow best practices and to do the best they can in their ministry, and to hold clergy accountable when they violate those boundaries.
It strikes me that being a pastor involves knowing all sorts of information that might not be widely known. Pastors often know issues of what's happening within a marriage, issues of addiction, really where someone is in their faith journey, what they're questioning, what they're doubting, what they're wondering about. Pastors have all sorts of information that one might not, say, put up on Facebook or want commonly known. And yet we learn to hold that information and to treat it carefully and faithfully.
That's exactly the same with money as well. We know how to hold that information confidentially. We know how and when it's appropriate to be transparent about things, but also how to hold those things appropriately. I think there's a real difference between keeping secrets and holding confidences. In the church, we are not in the business of keeping secrets, any sort of secret, but we are in the business of holding appropriate confidentiality. So just as I'm not about to share who gives what, unless I've been given explicit permission to do so or invited to do so by the donor themselves, I'm also not going to share confidential things about one's marriage or one's job or one's doubts about their faith or the ways that their faith might be growing or changing. Those things we hold close in our hearts. We talk about those things with our parishioners appropriately.
All of that really speaks to pastors knowing this information, because really generosity is a spiritual practice. And just as pastors need to know what's going on in someone's prayer life, or what Bible passage they struggle with or treasure, or what justice cause they're committed to, this is really part of the spiritual office of the pastor, because generosity is a spiritual practice. I'm wondering, Elizabeth, if you can help me think through or have any suggestions for a congregation that wants to move in this direction, wants to move towards having their pastor know and have access to this information about giving and pledging. What things might a congregation's leadership think about?
Yeah, that's such a really good and important question. And I think it's a question both for the leadership and for the pastor themselves. Some of us clergy have been trained to only think of ourselves as spiritual leaders and to think of worldly matters such as buildings and grounds and finances as not in our purview. But the work of pastor, that word pastor comes from the word parson, which in turn comes from the word person. So as pastors, we are parsons and called to be whole persons, involved in the whole scope of life. So that's where we begin. Congregations also have a story to tell about money itself. These cultures in which there is a great deal of secrecy around money have a story behind them. Sometimes that story has to do with previous misconduct, whether by a pastor or by a lay leader, or even something that just happened to another church down the road or in their community. So I think that church leadership, including pastors, should really be attentive to learning the church's story about money and how they relate to money as a first step. Some churches are great with budgeting and they're pledging and giving. People not only pledge generously, but they fulfill their pledges at very high rates. Other churches have lots of people who say, I don't pledge, but if there is a need, we will always give. What are the stories behind those reasons? Let's first learn those. Secondly, we know that change happens only at the speed of trust. So we're learning those stories as a way of gaining the trust of the congregation as a whole. Using that trust is something that we do with, again, great integrity and great intention. But having built that trust through our own trustworthiness, through those conversations, we can then begin to talk about what are some best practices. If we want to grow our church, if we want to grow the stewardship of our church and our capacity to make a difference in the community, we see that there's lots of data that says pastors who know that information are parts of congregations where they can raise money more effectively. So let's draw on that data, let's draw on that, and then continue to make a change. Andrew, we were talking earlier, and you said something really insightful, which was, let's also not assume that churches are invested in a culture of secrecy around money. While that may be the practice, there might be plenty of people in the church who say, wow, this isn't really a best practice. We really want to change this. And so let's have those conversations. Let's talk about the difference between who needs to know that information and that confidentiality, and also transparency. So we want to be fully transparent with those who need to know this information. And we also know that not everyone needs to know everything about every detail regarding money. But our pastor, as the spiritual leader of our congregation, and as essentially an executive director of a community nonprofit, needs to know who its donors are so that they can better minister to them and lead with them.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was really helpful. I particularly appreciate the distinction you were making between having a culture of secrecy and a culture of transparency, and that values confidentiality. I think that's a really helpful distinction to make, and a place for congregations to do some check-in with their own culture and their congregation. And also the reminder to be in touch with the story of wealth and the relationship with money that a congregation embodies as a corporate being, not just as the relationship that we have as individuals.
Yes.